Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to Popular Albums versus Favorite Albums. So, I've always been intrigued by what makes something a popular album versus someone's favorite album. And there could be any number of things in there that do it. Certainly popular albums, radio hits, sales, things like that. The albums that have a life cycle that just keep coming back. Favorite albums can have to do with nostalgia, the time you got into a band, the era, all that sort of stuff. It may not have anything to do with the hits or sales on these things. And for me, putting together top 10 lists, album rankings, stuff like that, I often found that my favorite albums weren't the popular albums. And I didn't really know that until I got into doing this. So I thought it'd be kind of cool to do a rundown comparison of some of the biggest bands and their popular albums versus my favorite albums. I'm going to try to explain the differences in that, why I feel the way that I feel, and I think that'll be a fun sort of overview of what this idea is, the difference between a popular versus a favorite. And we're going to get into it here in just a bit. But before we start, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things do help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by turning on notifications, you're going to stay up to date on everything going on in the world of music, just like this, with a video about popular albums versus favorite albums. And so in the last one, we covered the initial part of the alphabet, starting in A. I think we ended on J. And so this one here, we're picking up with letter L in this, but I'm going to cover 5 bands, 10 albums. I'll do the comparisons on it, and we'll see where this goes. But first up, as I said, we're going to kick off with the letter L in here. And this is one of the all-time biggest rock bands ever. And I don't think there's any question that this would be considered their most popular album. The Untitled, or Led Zeppelin 4 from 1971. It was their 4th studio album. It has sold 23 million copies in the US alone, an estimated 37 million copies around the world. And if that isn't enough in and of itself to say that this here is their most popular album, this also features Stairway to Heaven. And there's 8 songs on here, but I mean, with so many big hits on this thing, like Black Dog, Misty Mountain Hop, Going to California, just that one song, Stairway to Heaven, being on here in and of itself, I think will always keep this as the most popular. But all of those songs have been played on the radio. And I talked a bit about this last time, where some albums just feel worn out to me. Or not even so much album, all the songs on it do. And this is one of them. I've heard every one of these so often. If you turn on radio, you can hear some of these songs played almost every hour on the radio. And Led Zeppelin is one of those bands. And while I love those, and when I was first introduced to the band, this was the album I gravitated towards. This was the one that pulled me in as a kid. I understand why it is the most popular, but it is also one of the most worn out albums that I have, and I almost never pull it out. But what I do pull out, my favorite album by Led Zeppelin, Physical Graffiti from 1975. It's their 16th studio album, and certainly no slouch in the sales department or the hits department, because this thing sold 16 million copies. It's kind of an interesting story, and I think it's part of the reason that I actually really like this album, is that the band had written 8 new songs at the time, and it filled about 3 sides of an album. And it was more than a standard album, not enough for a double album. So the band decided to add 7 previously unreleased songs, go in and finish those off to create a true double album. And that idea of both old songs, new songs, the fact that it was a double album, like all those sort of things, I think really brought this one into having a different feel and an excitement for me that was different than the first album I'm introduced to, Led Zeppelin 4. But this one here is a real tour de force, so I think you could argue. A lot of people put this, like I do, as the #1 album, from the band kind of a thing, because it's got real standout rock songs, hard rock songs, progressive rock songs, orchestral rock songs. It's got folk elements. It's got all kinds of different things that work into it, really covering all different eras of the band. But it's also got big hits like The Rover, Kashmir, which is one of the most covered or sampled songs, I should really say, out of Led Zeppelin's catalog. And Down by the Seaside, which was an outtake from Led Zeppelin 4, and a beautiful song at that. So all in all, I get what makes something their most popular, but for me at least, I like to go to albums that aren't overly worn out. And maybe also because it's a double album, but I feel like there's more of that in Physical Graffiti that I can sink my teeth into than the single album's worth of tracks that are on 4. Okay, moving on. We're going to talk about Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. And I kind of had to really scratch my head about this because Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers is one of those bands where a lot of their albums have kind of all sold about the same. And they all kind of have hits on it. So which is really the most popular album? I don't know. This is the one I hear the most about, and it has certainly sold a lot. It has a lot of hits on it. So I'm calling this one the most popular. Damn the Torpedoes from 1979 is their third studio album, 3 million copies sold in the US, but it was the band's big breakthrough. The first 2 albums, very popular, but this was the one that shot the band into the stratosphere, that made them huge megastars. And these songs that are on this, still in the band's catalog today. Well, not today, but until Tom Petty passed away. I mean, they remained there. They're always going to be on the greatest hits kind of thing. You're always going to hear them on the radio sort of stuff. But 9 songs on this, 1 album. You've got Refugee on this. You've got Here Comes My Girl. You've got Even the Losers on this song, which was not a single at the time. And it would later become one of their biggest songs just through live performance and stuff like that, and is now on greatest hits albums and things of that nature. And I say that that is a testament to the album, that even when something wasn't a single, it could become that popular by how popular the album is. So that's why I leaned towards this one. And like I said, we could argue whether some of the other albums might even be their more popular album. And I'm not talking about the Tom Petty solo. We are talking about Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, because otherwise I might have brought in Full Moon Fever or something like that, or Wildflowers. Those are solo Petty albums. So we are talking about Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers band albums. And my favorite album by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers is Into the Great Wide Open, 1991. 8th studio album from the band. 9th one for Tom Petty, because he had just done Full Moon Fever, which was a huge, I think that was a 5 million seller. So, more sales than Damn the Torpedoes, more sales than this one. But of the Heartbreakers albums, this one here is my favorite album. It was certified double platinum, so it's not that far off. So again, arguably, where do we talk about in terms of something being popular? But for me, this being a favorite album, what I find most fascinating for myself at least is, I was not into this back in the day. I knew who they were. I enjoyed the album. I listened to it, saw the songs on MTV, heard them on the radio, but not enough that I wanted to go out and buy the album. But it is of my era. I was not around listening to music in 79. I was only 3 years old, so I didn't grow up listening to Damn the Torpedoes. I did grow up hearing this, so this one does have some of that nostalgia to it. But where I think is the real key that makes this album my favorite is the production. It's produced by Jeff Lynne, who actually produced the solo album that came before it, Full Moon Fever from Tom Petty. But I love ELO, and I love that layered production. And I talked about it before, about the era for which you come into things. And I'm an 80s child growing up with that production level of the 80s for what a lot of people call overproduction. But I love it. And this album has that sound. Even though it came out in 91, it is a very, very well-produced album that still has a lot of sheen on it before it really kind of all got stripped away in the early to late 90s era, and everything kind of came back to where it was. But this album here is consistently good all the way through. You've got the hits on it: Learning to Fly, King's Highway, Out in the Cold, the title track that's on here. But I think every other song on this is just as good. And this is also one of the ones that I love to drive to, that I have in my car, that when I put on, I don't even think about taking it out and popping something else in until I probably listen to it through 2 or 3 times. It is just that good of an album. And so there's other equally good songs that are on this, the lesser known ones like The Dark of the Sun or All or Nothing, that I think are as good as the rest of it. And I do attribute all of that to Jeff Lynne, the producer who pulled it all together, that gave it all a consistent sound and gave it that level of production. All right, staying in the letter P, but moving on to my favorite band, and the first album that I got by this band, but not my favorite, just the most popular. Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, 1973, 8th studio album, 15 million copies sold in the US alone, but an estimated 45 million copies worldwide, certainly making it arguably their most popular album. I think we could debate it against The Wall and what that has meant for the band and how its association with the band. But I'm going to go with this one as the most popular album. It made a lot of recording advancements at the time. It's engineered by Alan Parsons, who would go on to the Alan Parsons Project, him helping to give it that. This album is the longest running album on the Billboard 200 album chart at 998 weeks or something. We're like 2 weeks away from this thing being 1,000 weeks on the chart. It'll hit it soon enough, I'm sure. But it's both beautiful, it's spiritual, it's dark, it's got guitar nuances. It's amazing. It's got stellar tracks on it. I totally understand why this thing is the most popular album, with songs like Time, Great Gig in the Sky, which is actually not a favorite song of mine, Money. And Great Gig in the Sky is actually one reason that I don't gravitate a lot back towards this. But again, those songs on here are just kind of worn out because it's played in every live Pink Floyd show. It's on every greatest hits. It's out on the radio, just all that sort of stuff. But this one is a classic case of nostalgia and time frame, because my most favorite Pink Floyd album is Division Bell from 1994. It's the first new Pink Floyd album that came out when I was a fan. So 2 years before this, in 1992, I got my first copy of Dark Side of the Moon, for which I went head over heels for. And I was in love with Pink Floyd at that time. When this came out, being a brand new album, being my album, not my brother's, not my, other people's, this was my Pink Floyd. And I did grow up with the previous album from 87, Momentary Lapse of Reason. I loved those songs and that album, but again, this came out when I was officially a fan. The hype behind this, everything. I remember when this thing came out, the hype machine, the promotion machine was in full force like I had never seen before. It was a spectacle. The band did this live broadcast to announce it. Radio stations stopped what they were doing to tune in for it. They had painted an airship, a Zeppelin, like a fish, flown it around to bring awareness to this sort of thing. I mean, the hoopla behind the announcement of Division Bell was crazy. I mean, I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it, because I remember as a kid driving around. I was 16 at the time. I'm driving around, and I was I guess I would have been a little bit older at this point, 18. But driving around, and I pulled over to the side of the road to like really listen to the radio about whatever this big announcement was going to be, because I had no idea. Not only were they announcing that they were going back on tour, but they had this brand new album. And I was over the moon about that. And so all of that in this, every time I pull this out, I see the cover, I put it on, I listen to the song Take It Back, the songs that were popular songs like High Hopes and stuff like that. Those songs on this thing always take me back. So there's a lot of nostalgia in this. This is also one of the best sounding albums that I have within my catalog, at least of my opinion, because whenever I want to test out a stereo system, I bring this along with me to give a listen to, because I know it's so intently. I know all the little nuances of this album that I can hear when things are at the right level, where they're supposed to be or they're not, or that different kind of stuff. So when I was buying a new stereo system a year or so back, I took this album with me along with some others, but I took this one here, and that's how I determined which were the right set of speakers for me. But this album here really is a nostalgic thing. I think this thing sold 2 million copies, maybe a little bit more, so nowhere near what Dark Side of the Moon did. But this album here is always going to be one of my favorites, and I saw the band on the tour, so again, just tons and tons of nostalgia in the era when I came into the band, and all that kind of stuff leads to this. All right, next up, we're going to talk Van Halen. And this is one of those bands where I could have gone any number of ways because, again, they've got a lot of big selling albums and a lot of big hits across multiple albums. So I think you could easily have said that Van Halen 1 is their most popular album. But for me, I remember growing up, this was the big key album. So I'm going to say 1984, the big famous, iconic, popular album of Van Halen, also released in '84, sixth studio album featuring, or the last album that featured David Lee Roth on it. But really, it's the songs that are on this for why I'm saying it is their most popular album. It has sold 10 million copies the same way the debut album has sold 10 million copies. So in terms of just sales, they're equivalent in that regard. But having songs like Jump, Panama, Hot for Teacher, I'll Wait, all those songs on this album here really puts it over the top in terms of what I think of as a popular album. When I went out in the mid 80s and I'd had my cassette player if you remember from the previous episode, I talked about my brother giving that to me with Def Leppard's Pyromania. Now I'm out buying my own albums. I want to go buy a Van Halen album. I bought this album because of Jump in Panama. That was, to me, what pulled me in, not one of the other albums. So as a popular album, I'm sticking with that. But the song I'll Wait on here I thought was an interesting one because it really kind of foreshadowed where the band was going to go on 5150 with Sammy Hagar on down the road. So this album was an interesting one, being the last one with David Lee Roth right before Sammy Hagar joins, but at the same time starting to really pull in the keyboards and all those sort of things. And so I think it's a cool bridge album, and it probably is also one of those ones that Sammy Hagar fans can easily get into, maybe more so than the debut. But I do think that is one of the reasons that 1984 is consistently a popular album. Now, you might think that because of the era for which I came into the band and the band putting out albums of the Sammy Hagar era while I was growing up that were new to me would be my favorite, but it's actually not. My favorite, most favorite Van Halen album has nothing to do with nostalgia, actually. It doesn't have anything to do with my older brothers. It doesn't have anything to do with me growing up with them. It's actually Van Halen 2 from 1979, and I would simply say this is just a classic case in the songs that are on here speak to me more than songs from anything else. Songs that are on here, I hear on the radio everywhere. So it is a classic case if I don't pull this out often because I know these songs inside and out, almost worn out by the radio. Whereas these songs that are on here, big hits, yes, but not played on the radio nearly as much as these are. So this one here, first track that's on here, You're No Good, Dance the Night Away has got to be my all-time favorite Van Halen song. So that's probably one of the reasons that I select this. But then again, did it become an all-time Van Halen song after I was already into the album? Who knows, right? Somebody Get Me a Doctor is on here. It's got hits on it like DOA and Beautiful Girls. And Beautiful Girls, another one that is just an absolute favorite of mine from the Van Halen catalog. But the whole album, for me at least, is pure Van Halen. Start to finish, I love it. It's everything that I love about the band all rolled into one on this album. Without any of the songs being too big or too worn out, I can go back to this one time and time again. But I do find it interesting that this album here is not the first one I bought. It is not the first album I bought by Van Halen that was new to me, which was For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, you would think that that one would be my favorite album, you know, my Van Halen, that kind of a thing. Years and years later, I would buy this, and I've grown to love this more than anything else. So this one's kind of question mark as to what makes it my favorite, but as best I can, think is it's legitimately a great album that upon listening to it became my favorite, became my own album because the songs were just simply that good. All right. And the last band we're going to touch on here, one of my favorite bands of the prog rock movement. Yes, that's why I'm wearing this shirt. And again, this is one of those ones where it's a little hard sometimes to say what is the band's most popular album. I'm actually choosing to put in here two albums that contain roughly the same people on them as opposed to two very distinct different lineups. Like I easily could have done, the 90125 album where Owner of a Lonely Heart, arguably very popular, but I'm going to go with the 1971 album Fragile as their most popular, at least maybe most agreed upon, or their initial most popular album before a revamped lineup came around in, I think, 83. But this album here, their fourth studio album, Fragile, it's certified double platinum, so it certainly has good sales behind it. It was the first album to feature Rick Wakeman on keyboards, taking over for Tony Kaye, who I love, who came back later on. He was part of the 90125 era of the band. One of my reasons for not liking this, though, is the makeup of the album itself. And this was due to budget and time constraints, where 4 of the tracks are by the whole band and 5 of the tracks are actually solo pieces by individual members of the band. Now, an interesting concept, except that the individual natures of the band I often find are not my cup of tea, but when they all come together, that is when I really love the sound of Yes. It's the melding of those things. So I love the 4 tracks that are the band. I don't really like the solo pieces that are on here. I find it too disjointive for me. So while tons of people love this, it was their first big album. It has sold a lot of stuff. Not my most favorite album by the band, even though it's got their most recognizable hit, Roundabout, and then other well-known tracks that are on here like Long Distance Runaround, Heart of the Sunrise. So understandable that it's popular, just not my most favorite. Now this one here is going to boggle some people's minds. Even the most ardent Yes fan may question me on this one. But my favorite Yes album is Union from 1991. 13th studio album, only went gold. Hey, that's still pretty good though. But it's an amalgamation of what was the current lineup of Yes at the time, which was the carryover from 90125. I always have to think about that, trying not to mix it up with whatever was the Beverly Hills TV show zip code. And Anderson, Buford, Wakeman, Howe project, right? So those two versions of Yes come together on Union, hence the name of it. What's also interesting in this is that we have future Yes keyboardist and future Yes guitarist and future Yes bassist, because he's played so many different roles in the band. Billy Sherwood contributes to this album as well. Like I said, later on joining in 1997 and coming and going at different times. He's currently with the band again, but he plays bass for the band right now. So interestingly, in this one here, a lot of people don't like the production on this one. I've got no issues with it. I know that there's certainly some bad blood, or the guys didn't see eye to eye between the producer itself, Jonathan Ellis, on this, and John Anderson, who had some conflicts on it. And John Anderson has spoken about this. So I know there's that. And I know that a lot of the band members actually don't enjoy this album because really it was just a, hey, let's get together, let's do this, but it really wasn't collaborative. And therein and of itself, I can understand why people don't really care for this album, because 2 of the songs that came off of this, Lift Me Up, which was a Yes song, and it became a Billboard mainstream rock track, topped the chart for that, so it did well there. I Would Have Waited Forever, which was an Anderson, Buford, Wakeman, Howe song, really they just took songs that were from one project, songs from another project, put them all together. John Anderson sings on every one of them, and they called it a Yes album. It might have been a bit over bloated. I think there's 15 songs on this thing here. But clearly, it is two versions of Yes coming together, and I can hear that in the songs themselves. But that in and of itself is what appealed to me about it. Was I liked the current version of Yes at the time. I liked Anderson, Buford, Wakeman, Howe. The fact that they made this album together, I thought was really cool. And so I dug that. But at the same time, I understand that it wasn't what a lot of fans wanted. And that is one of the reasons why this is consistently low for a lot of Yes fans, and why it probably hasn't remained as popular as it was at the time, just initially being a union album where they all came back together. But for me, I love the album, and it's the beauty in that for where an album like this can be a favorite for me, whereas the most popular album that some people love can't understand how that could not be a favorite for me, and why it is that I would gravitate towards something like this. But there you go, a run through of some of the most popular albums versus my favorite albums. As a reminder, there was a part 1 to this where I covered AC/DC, Aerosmith, Def Leppard, Fleetwood Mac, Journey. If those bands are interesting to you and you want to check out the popular versus my favorite, I'm going to leave a link in the description. You can check that out. But for other bands we talked about today, let me know which ones are your favorites of those, and whether or not it is the most popular, or like me, maybe you're weird and you like a really odd album that nobody else likes, and why it is that that one is your absolute favorite. All right, everyone, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.